The headlines move on, but the question doesn't. When the spotlight shuts off, what happens next? Elena is 48, a former model turned a ruthless high-society PR mogul in Dubai, the city of gold and perfection. She built careers, buried scandals, and controlled narratives, until one night when God exposed the one truth she couldn't spin. And here's why you need to watch to the end. Elena says the warning she received wasn't just about celebrities. It was about you and me. And she explains exactly how the Hall of Fame becomes a hallway to destruction. Don't blink. Don't scroll. Here is Elena.
I died looking at a wrinkle. It wasn't even a deep line. It was a faint hairline fracture in the foundation of my face, right beside my left eye. I was 48 years old, standing in the most expensive VIP suite in Dubai, surrounded by gold leaf and marble, and I was terrified. I pressed my finger against the skin, pulling it taut, watching the line disappear, pretending that I could hold back time with just the pressure of my manicured nail. That was my religion. That was my worship. I didn't bow to God, I bowed to the mirror. My name is Elena, and if you lived in the high society circles of the Middle East, you knew that name. They called me the Iron Orchid. I owned the biggest PR firm in the city. I decided who was famous, who was beautiful, and who was irrelevant. I had spent 2 decades curating a life that looked perfect from the outside. I wore a midnight blue silk gown that cost more than a house, encrusted with crystals that caught the lights of the vanity mirror. I looked like a queen. But inside I was rotting. I was starving for a validation that no amount of money could buy. I need you to understand the mindset I had before everything went dark. I was not just indifferent to faith, I was hostile to it. I remember, just 2 days before this night, walking into the break room and catching my personal assistant crying over a video on her phone. She was a sweet girl, too soft for my industry. She tried to hide the screen, but I snatched it from her. She was watching one of those Christian testimonies on YouTube. It was a video about testimonies of hell and repentance. I remember the sneer that curled on my lip. I looked at her and asked why a smart girl would waste company time on fairy tales. She looked at me with this pity in her eyes that made me furious. She told me it was one of the most impactful testimonies she had ever seen, a near-death experience that changed a man's life. I laughed at her. I told her that evangelical testimonies were emotional crutches for people who couldn't handle reality. I told her that powerful testimonies didn't come from God. They came from PR agents like me who knew how to spin a story. I threw her phone back on the table and told her to get back to work. I told her that I was the one who signed her checks, not Jesus. That arrogance was the armor I wore. I truly believed I was untouchable. I believed that death was a technical problem that science would eventually solve, and until then, I had Botox and fillers. I was a god in my own little universe. But standing in front of that mirror, the universe decided to humble me. It didn't happen with pain. That is the biggest lie movies tell you. There was no clutching of the chest, no dramatic gasp. It happened with silence. I was reaching for a jar of concealer to hide that tiny line near my eye. My hand was mid-air. Suddenly, the hum of the air conditioning cut out. The distant thumping bass from the gala downstairs vanished. The world didn't just get quiet, it went dead. It felt like someone had pulled the master plug on reality. I tried to ask, "What happened?" The words were formed in my brain. I knew what I wanted to say, but the signal never reached my mouth. My jaw hung open, slack and heavy. My tongue felt like a piece of dead meat in my mouth. I watched my own reflection in the mirror, and I saw the confusion turn into absolute horror. The woman in the glass was staring back at me, one eye drooping, the left side of her face sliding down like melting wax. I realized with a jolt of cold, clinical panic, I am having a stroke. I commanded my hand to grab the counter, grab it, steady yourself. But my hand didn't obey. It dropped like a stone, knocking the glass jar of concealer onto the floor. I saw it hit the tiles. I saw the glass shatter into 100 sparkling diamonds. I saw the beige cream splatter across the pristine white floor. But I heard nothing. No crash, no tinkle of glass. Just a suffocating, heavy silence. My legs gave way. I didn't fall gracefully like they do in the movies. I crumbled, my knees buckled, and I slammed sideways into the vanity chair before hitting the floor hard. I felt the impact rattle my teeth, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else's body. I was lying on the cold tiles, my cheek pressed against the scattered shards of glass and expensive makeup. The smell of the concealer, sweet, powdery, chemical, filled my nose. It was the smell of my vanity, and now I was drowning in it. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. One eye was pressed against the floor, but the other was staring wide open at the ceiling. I saw the gold molding. I saw the bright, harsh lights of the vanity burning down on me. I looked like a broken doll thrown in the corner. And then the thoughts came. Not prayers, not regrets, just pure, selfish anger. Not now, I screamed in the silence of my mind. I have a speech to give. I have photographers waiting. Look at me. I look ridiculous. If someone finds me like this, it will ruin my brand. I was dying, and my only concern was my brand. I was slipping out of existence, and I was worried about the angle of the photos. That is how deep the sickness of pride goes. It follows you to the grave. The lights above me began to stretch. The white glare didn't fade. It intensified. It became aggressive, a blinding whiteness that burned through my retina and into my brain. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight, crushing the air out of my lungs. Then, the fear hit. It wasn't a panic attack. It was the primal, terrifying realization that I was alone. I had millions of followers. I had contacts in every major corporation. I had a security team outside the door, but none of them could reach me here. I was enclosed in a capsule of isolation. I was leaving. Please, I thought, a sudden desperate crack forming in my armor. I'm not ready. I haven't finished. The world didn't care. The ceiling dissolved. The floor dissolved. The sensation of the cold tiles vanished. The smell of the makeup evaporated. I was no longer a woman in a blue dress. I was a spark of terrified consciousness being ripped out of a dying shell. The white light snapped off. Instantly. I expected non-existence. I expected the screen to go black and the movie to end. I was an atheist. I believed that when the brain died, the I died. I believed I would simply cease to be, like a candle blown out. But I didn't cease to be. I was more me than I had ever been. The brain fog was gone. The fatigue of being 48 was gone. I was hyper-aware, hyper-conscious, and I was falling. It was a sensation of pure velocity. I was plummeting through a void that was darker than any night I had ever seen. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a darkness that felt thick, like oil. I tried to scream, but I had no voice. I tried to flail my arms, but I couldn't feel my limbs. I was just a point of awareness, dropping like a stone into a bottomless well. And then, impact. I didn't hit the ground. I hit a sudden change in atmosphere. The falling stopped instantly, snapping me back into a vertical position. The transition was so violent, it felt like my soul had been shoved back into a container that was too tight. I gasped, a loud, ragged intake of breath that tore at my throat. I was standing. I could feel my feet. I could feel the weight of my body. My eyes snapped open. I was expecting the hospital. I was expecting the bright, sterile lights of an emergency room, the beep of machines, the faces of concerned doctors telling me I had a close call. I was ready to be relieved. I was ready to spin this into a story of survival for the press. But I wasn't in a hospital. I was standing on a carpet. It was deep red, plush, and stretched out in front of me like a tongue. The air was not the cool, filtered air of a medical facility. It was hot, humid, and heavy. It smelled of expensive perfume, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and something burning, like hair caught in a dryer. I looked down at myself. I was still wearing the blue silk gown. The diamonds were still around my neck. My hands were still manicured. I checked my face. No drooping. I could move. I could speak. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded flat, dead. The air swallowed the sound instantly. I looked up. I was standing in what looked like the entrance to the most exclusive event in the world. There were velvet ropes, thick red velvet ropes held up by gold stanchions, creating a narrow pathway. On either side of the ropes, there was a thick, impenetrable gray fog. I couldn't see what was in the fog, but I could hear it. I heard movement, shuffling, low growls, the sound of thousands of people holding their breath. But ahead of me, the path was clear. It led toward a massive set of double doors that towered into the darkness. They were black, polished to a mirror shine, and framed in pulsing gold light. Above the doors, a sign flickered in neon that looked like molten lava. The Hall of Fame. I felt a surge of confusion mixed with an instinctive thrill. The Hall of Fame? Was this an exclusive after-party? Had I been moved here while I was unconscious? My vanity jumped to the driver's seat immediately. Of course, I was the Iron Orchid. I didn't go to hospitals. I went to galas. Even in my confusion, my pride tried to make sense of the impossible. I took a step forward. The red carpet felt wrong. It was spongy, warm. It felt like walking on flesh. I looked ahead and saw I wasn't alone. There was a line, a queue of people waiting to get in. I recognized the woman in front of me. I gasped. It was a famous actress from the 90s, a woman who had been obsessed with her youth, who had died in a car crash years ago. She was wearing the silver dress she died in. Her hair was perfect, but she was standing rigid, vibrating with tension. "Excuse me," I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Where are we?" She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge me. She just took a robotic step forward as the line moved. I looked at the bouncer standing by the great black doors. He was 7 feet tall, wearing a tuxedo that was too tight. His skin was gray, like wet clay. He held a clipboard. He looked at the person at the front of the line, checked the list, and smiled. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a gash in his face, revealing too many teeth. "Welcome," the bouncer said. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "You have been waiting for this. The world knows your name. Now, you will never be forgotten." He unhooked the velvet rope. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. This wasn't a party. The smell was getting stronger, the rotting sweetness. The fog on the sides of the path seemed to be pressing in, and I saw shapes moving in the mist, long, spindly limbs, eyes that glowed with a pale, hungry yellow light. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and sprint back into the darkness. But my feet wouldn't turn. The desire to be seen, the desire that had driven me my whole life, was pulling me forward like a magnet. I had spent 48 years trying to get past the velvet rope. Now, I was here, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I didn't want to go inside. But the line moved, and I moved with it. I stood on that warm, pulsing carpet, trapped in a procession of the vein. The air around us was thick with a strange, narcotic quality. It smelled of ozone and expensive perfume, but beneath the layers of jasmine and sandalwood lay the undeniable stench of panic. I looked at the people ahead of me and behind me. I recognized faces. These weren't just random souls. They were the elite. I saw a politician known for his perfect smile and his corrupt deals. I saw a social media influencer, a girl barely 20, who had died overdosing in a hotel room last year. She was frantically smoothing her hair, checking her reflection in the polished gold of a stanchion, her eyes wide with a terror she was trying desperately to hide. The silence in the line was heavy. No one spoke. In life, these people would have been shouting, demanding better tables, calling for managers. Here, they were docile, they were cowed. But their eyes were alive, darting back and forth, fueled by a competitive desperation. Even here, at the gates of what I feared was damnation, we were still competing. I found myself straightening my posture, pulling my shoulders back. I caught myself checking the woman in front of me, noting that her hemline was frayed. At least I look better than her, I thought. The sickness of comparison followed me even into death. The line moved slowly, a sluggish shuffle toward the massive black doors. As I got closer, I could see the bouncers more clearly. There were 2 of them. They were tall, looming figures dressed in impeccably tailored suits that seemed to absorb the dim light. But when I looked at their faces, my mind recoiled. They had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, blank surface of pale skin stretched over a skull. Yet, they communicated. They held clipboards, checking names with long, spindly fingers that had too many joints. I reached the front of the line. The creature on the left turned its blank face toward me. I felt a pressure inside my head, a voice that didn't use ears but vibrated directly against my brain. "Name?" the voice asked. It was cold, efficient, like dragging a knife across ice. "Elena," I said, my voice trembling. "Elena Vance, the Iron Orchid." I said the title instinctively. It was my shield. It was my identity. The creature ran a finger down the list. I saw the paper on the clipboard. It wasn't paper. It looked like dried human skin, stretched thin and stitched together. The names were written in a fluid, shifting red ink that looked wet. "Ah, yes," the voice echoed in my skull. "Elena, the builder of images, the woman who polished dust. You are expected. You have a reserved placement." A sick feeling of pride twisted in my stomach. Reserved placement. Even here, I was a VIP. The absurdity of it should have made me scream. I was standing at the entrance to a nightmare, and yet part of me was relieved that I was on the list. That is the depth of the deception. The devil doesn't just scare you, he flatters you. He uses your own ego as the bait for the trap. The creature stepped aside, unhooking the heavy velvet rope. It gestured toward the open doors. "Enter," it commanded. "Your audience is waiting." I hesitated. The space beyond the doors was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear a sound. It was a low, rumbling roar. It sounded like the ocean, but as I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't water. It was applause. It was the sound of millions of hands clapping, a ceaseless, thunderous ovation that never peaked and never faded. It was the sound I had chased my entire career. Is it safe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The blank face didn't change, but I felt a wave of mockery emanate from the creature. "Safe?" the voice sneered. "Safety is for the anonymous. You wanted to be known. You wanted to be immortal. Go inside. Take your stage." The woman behind me, a CEO who had stepped over everyone to get to the top, shoved me forward. "Move," she hissed. "Don't block the entrance." The pressure was too much. The combination of the crowd pushing from behind and the allure of the applause ahead broke my resistance. I stepped across the threshold. The moment my heel touched the black marble floor inside, the doors slammed shut behind me. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing in the vastness. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in a second. The humid, cloying heat of the outside was replaced by a sterile, biting cold. It was the kind of cold that preserves things, the cold of a morgue. I was standing in a foyer. It was magnificent and terrible. The walls were lined with mirrors that stretched up into darkness, reflecting my image back at me 1,000 times. But the mirrors were distorted. In them, I didn't look like the powerful PR mogul. I looked small, fragile, and terrified. My skin in the reflection looked gray. My eyes looked hollow. I walked forward, the sound of my heels clicking sharply on the stone. The roar of applause was louder now, coming from a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. Above those doors was another sign, etched in gold that dripped like melting wax: the Grand Exhibition. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back, to pound on the doors I had just come through. I knew, deep in my spirit, that I had made a mistake. I wasn't a guest, I was inventory. But the corridor only went one way. The floor seemed to tilt slightly downward, pulling me toward the applause. I was gravity-fed into the machine of my own vanity. I reached the inner doors. They swung open automatically, sensing my approach. The noise hit me like a physical blow. The clapping was deafening. It vibrated in my teeth. It rattled my bones. I stepped into the room, shielding my eyes from the sudden glare of spotlights that swiveled to pin me against the darkness. "Welcome, Elena," a voice boomed over a PA system that sounded distorted and screeching. "The collection is finally complete." I stood there, blinded by the lights, freezing in my thin silk dress while the invisible crowd screamed my name. But there was no love in the sound. It was a hungry sound. It was the sound of a crowd that wants to see a sacrifice. The doors behind me fused shut, with a sound that felt less like a lock clicking into place, and more like the heavy, final thud of a tomb ceiling. I was inside. The room I had entered, if it could even be called a room, was a cavernous, industrial expanse that defied the logic of architecture. It stretched out infinitely in every direction, a vast, echoing hangar of polished black marble and blinding artificial light. The ceiling was lost in a thick, swirling gloom, but suspended from that darkness were thousands of massive theatrical spotlights. They hung like predatory birds, their beams cutting through the freezing air to illuminate specific points on the floor. The temperature was violently cold, a dry, sterile freeze that bit through the thin silk of my gown and made my skin contract instantly. It wasn't the natural cold of winter. It was the preservation chill of a cryogenics lab designed to keep meat from spoiling. But the cold was secondary to the noise. The applause was a physical weapon here. It didn't sound like a celebration. It sounded like an avalanche. It was a dense, wall-to-wall roar of clapping hands, whistling and stomping feet that hit me with the force of a shockwave. It vibrated in the fillings of my teeth and rattled the bones of my inner ear, making it impossible to find my balance. I stumbled forward, my heels clacking sharply on the obsidian floor, clutching my head with both hands, trying to shield my mind from the auditory assault. It was the sound I had spent my entire life chasing, the sound of validation, of adoration, of the world acknowledging my existence. But here, amplified to this deafening industrial level, it was stripped of all affection. It was a mechanical, grinding roar that demanded performance. I forced my eyes open against the glare. As my vision adjusted to the harsh contrast between the blinding spotlights and the surrounding shadows, the horror of the Grand Exhibition began to reveal itself. I was standing at the head of a wide central aisle, flanked on both sides by rows of pedestals. They stretched on forever, vanishing into the distant haze of the hall. The pedestals were made of different materials. Some were gold, some platinum, some polished onyx, others crystal. They were spaced perfectly apart, like displays in a high-end museum or a luxury department store. And atop every single pedestal stood a figure. At first glance, I thought they were statues. They had to be. They were too perfect, too still, too rigid to be anything biological. I walked toward the nearest one on my left, drawn by a morbid, paralyzed curiosity. The pedestal was made of brushed steel, cold and clinical. The figure standing on it was a man I vaguely recognized, a tech billionaire who had died of pancreatic cancer a few years ago. He was famous for his ruthlessness and his obsession with biohacking, trying to upload his consciousness to the cloud to live forever. He stood in a power pose, arms folded across his chest, chin tilted upward in a look of visionary defiance. His skin looked like it had been dipped in liquid chrome. It shone under the spotlight with a hard metallic luster. He looked magnificent, a monument to human ambition frozen in time. But then I got closer. I stepped up to the velvet rope that surrounded his display. The applause in this section of the hall seemed to focus on him, a directed beam of noise. I looked up into his face, into the chrome features that I thought were sculpted metal. And then I saw the eye. His left eye twitched. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny, frantic spasm of the pupil. I leaned in, my breath hitching in my throat. These were not statues. They were not sculptures. They were souls. The man was fully conscious. I could see it in the wet, terrified depth of his eyes. He was trapped inside a shell of his own making. The chrome skin wasn't a coating. It was his own spiritual flesh, hardened and calcified into a rigid, immovable prison. He was locked in the pose of his greatest arrogance, forced to stand with his arms crossed and his chin up, projecting strength while internally he was screaming. I saw a bead of sweat, real, human sweat, push its way through a pore on his metallic forehead. It rolled down the side of his nose, but he couldn't wipe it away. He couldn't blink. He couldn't shift his weight. He was a prisoner in the statue of himself. I recoiled, stumbling back from the pedestal. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I spun around and looked at the other displays. To my right was a woman on a pedestal of rose gold. She was a pop star, a girl whose face had been on every billboard in the world. She was frozen in mid-laugh, her head thrown back, one hand holding a microphone that was fused to her palm. It looked like a moment of pure joy, the kind of candid shot that magazines pay millions for. But when I looked closer, I saw the truth. Her jaw was locked open. The muscles in her neck were strained tight as cables, trembling with the effort of holding the pose. Her eyes were wide, rolling frantically in their sockets, pleading with the invisible audience. She was choking on her own laughter, paralyzed in a permanent performance of happiness while her soul was drowning in terror. I walked down the aisle, the horror mounting with every step. The sheer variety of the torment was staggering. There were politicians frozen mid-speech, their fingers pointing accusingly at an unseen enemy, their mouths open in a silent shout that would never end. There were models frozen in impossible, spinal-twisting poses, their bodies contorted to highlight their curves, locked in a spasm of vanity that had become their cage. There were religious leaders, men I recognized from television, frozen with their hands raised to heaven, their faces masks of pious devotion, while their eyes betrayed a burning, desperate realization that they were looking up at a ceiling of iron, not a heaven of grace. The hall was a library of idolatry. Each person was trapped in the specific image they had worshipped in life. I stopped in front of a pedestal that was different. It wasn't gold or steel. It was made of mirrors. Standing on it was a woman who looked terrifyingly familiar. She was a socialite I had known, a woman who had been obsessed with surgery, with modifying her face until it was perfect. Here, she was a statue of glass. Her skin was transparent, revealing the muscle and bone beneath, but the surface was hard and unyielding. She was posing with a hand on her hip, blowing a kiss. As I stared at her, the applause track shifted. Underneath the roaring clapping, I began to hear another sound. It was a low, sibilant whispering. It sounded like a million snakes hissing over dry leaves. I strained my ears to make out the words. Look at her neck. You can see the scars. She looks so old. Who is she trying to fool? Fake. 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 The whisper was coming from the air itself, a recorded loop of gossip and judgment. I saw the woman's eyes inside the glass shell widen. She could hear it. She was forced to stand there, exposed, transparent, and beautiful, while an eternal track of criticism played in her ears. She was being consumed by the very judgment she had spent her life trying to avoid. She couldn't cover her ears. She couldn't hide her face. She was an object, placed there to be inspected. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I thought I would vomit on the pristine black floor. This wasn't fire and brimstone. This was far worse. This was psychological vivisection. It was a hell custom designed for the narcissist. It gave you exactly what you wanted, eternal attention, and turned it into the ultimate torture. "Please," I whispered, though I knew no one could hear me over the roar. "Let me out." I started to run. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from the eyes of the statues. I felt them watching me as I passed. I felt their envy. I was still moving. I was still soft. I hadn't hardened yet. I ran past rows of athletes frozen in mid-sprint, past writers frozen over typewriters with their hands fused to the keys. The hall seemed to have no end. It just went on and on, a factory line of damned egos. Then I saw the audience. For the first few minutes, I had been so focused on the exhibits that I hadn't looked into the darkness beyond the spotlights. The applause had to be coming from somewhere. I slowed my pace, panting, the cold air burning my lungs. I walked to the edge of the aisle, where the polished floor dropped off into a dark pit that separated the stage from the seating. I leaned over the edge. The darkness was alive. Thousands of feet below, in a pit that smelled of sulfur and wet dog, was a sea of writhing shapes. They were not human. They were shadows, jagged and frantic. I couldn't see faces, but I saw limbs, too many limbs, thrashing in a frenzy of mockery. They were the source of the applause. But they weren't clapping hands. They were slapping their own bodies, beating their chests, clicking pincers and claws together to mimic the sound of ovation. And they were laughing. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of feeding. They were looking up at the statues, at the frozen souls on the pedestals, and they were drinking in the despair. Every time a statue felt fear, the applause from the pit grew louder. Every time a soul screamed internally, the shadows below shrieked with delight. I realized then the economy of this place. It was a farm. The statues were the crops, and their vanity was the fertilizer. The demons below were harvesting the agony of regret. I pulled back from the edge, trembling violently. I turned to run back to the center of the aisle, but I collided with something hard. I stumbled back and looked up. Standing in front of me was a pedestal. It was empty. It was made of black marble, veined with gold. It was tall, sleek, and terrifyingly elegant. It was the most beautiful thing in the room. A single, blindingly hot spotlight was trained on the empty surface, waiting for its occupant. I looked at the plaque at the base of the pedestal. The letters were etched in fresh, smoking blood. Elena Vance, the iron orchid, she who built walls to hide herself, permanent exhibit. The breath left my body. It wasn't a random empty spot. It was my spot. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just a visitor. I was the next installation. I looked at the empty surface of the stone, and I could already feel the phantom sensation of my feet being fused to it. I could feel the ghost of the paralysis creeping up my legs. "No," I said, my voice rising to a scream that was instantly swallowed by the applause. "No, I refuse." But the hall didn't care about my refusal. The applause grew louder. The whispers in the air changed. They stopped criticizing the other statues and started whispering a new name. "Elena, here she is, finally. Look at her. She thinks she's special. Put her on the stand. Let us see her." The sound of my own name being chanted by a million demons was a violation I cannot describe. It felt like dirty hands touching my soul. I backed away from the pedestal, shaking my head, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "I am not a statue," I screamed at the darkness. "I am a person. I am alive." But as I shouted, I felt a change in my own body. My skin, which had been shivering from the cold, suddenly felt heavy, dense. I looked down at my hand. The skin was losing its pink hue. It was turning a pale, flat alabaster. The process had begun. I wasn't just going to be placed on the pedestal. I was becoming the exhibit. My vanity, the shell I had built around myself for 48 years, was finally hardening into a permanent reality. I was turning into the image I had tried so hard to project. I was becoming perfect, hard, and dead. And from the shadows of the aisle, I heard the click-clack of footsteps, not the frantic shuffle of a prisoner, but the measured, confident stride of a curator. Someone was coming to collect me. The footsteps stopped just outside the perimeter of the blinding spotlight. I was huddled against the base of my own pedestal, clutching my arms, trying to rub warmth back into skin that was rapidly turning into stone. The paralysis in my hands had advanced. My fingers felt stiff, like joints that had rusted over, and the sensation of touch was dulling into a numb, heavy pressure. I looked up, squinting against the glare, terrified of what monster had come to claim me. But the figure that stepped into the light was not a monster, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a man. He was tall, lean, and devastatingly handsome, dressed in a tuxedo that fit with a precision that bordered on supernatural. His hair was slicked back, black and glossy as oil. His face was a composite of every leading man I had ever cast in a campaign: strong jaw, high cheekbones, perfect teeth. He looked like a creative director, an agent, a man who made things happen. He carried a sleek black tablet in one hand and a gold stylus in the other. He looked down at me with a smile that was practiced, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a surgeon about to make an incision. "Elena," he said. His voice was smooth, a rich baritone that cut through the roaring applause like a knife through silk. "You are making a scene. It is unbecoming of a centerpiece." He didn't reach out to help me up. He simply tapped his stylus against the tablet, scrolling through data. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice cracking. Are you the devil?" He laughed. It was a dry, polite chuckle, the kind you hear at board meetings when the boss makes a bad joke. "The devil is the CEO, Elena. I am merely a curator. I manage the collections, specifically the Vanity Collection. And I must say, your arrival has been highly anticipated. We have been preparing your display for decades." He crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. Up close, the illusion of his beauty began to fracture. His skin was too perfect. It had no pores. His eyes were not brown or blue, but a shifting, swirling gray, like static on a television screen. And he smelled not of sulfur, but of a chemical sterility, formaldehyde and expensive cologne. "Please," I begged, the dignity of the iron orchid completely gone. "There has been a mistake. I don't belong here. I gave to charity. I helped people." The curator sighed, a sound of profound boredom. He stood up and offered me a hand. I hesitated, then took it. His grip was iron-hard and freezing cold. He pulled me to my feet with effortless strength, but he didn't let go. He held my wrist, lifting my arm into the light, inspecting the skin that was turning to alabaster. "You helped people," he repeated, examining my hardening forearm as if it were a piece of fabric. "Let us look at the data. You gave to charity, yes, and you made sure the press release went out before the check cleared. You helped people, yes, when it benefited your network. You didn't build relationships, Elena. You built mirrors. Every person in your life was just a reflective surface for you to admire yourself in." He dropped my arm. It fell to my side with a heavy wooden thud. The feeling was leaving my shoulder now. "Come," he said, turning his back on me. "We need to do a walkthrough before the final installation. There are some finishing touches your soul needs before it can be frozen." "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, trying to sound defiant, but backing away. The curator didn't turn around. He just snapped his fingers. Instantly, the floor beneath my feet lurched. The black marble tiles began to move like a conveyor belt, dragging me forward. I tried to run backward, but my legs were heavy, sluggish. The floor carried me effortlessly to his side. He didn't even look at me. He just started walking down the aisle, and the floor matched his pace, forcing me to walk with him. "This hall," he said, gesturing grandly with the stylus to the rows of frozen, screaming souls, "is a masterpiece of divine irony. You see, Elena, most people misunderstand hell. They think it is a place of arbitrary punishment. But it is not. It is a place of fulfilled desire. We passed a pedestal where a man was frozen in the act of flexing his biceps. His face was contorted in a scream, but his body was a perfect specimen of muscular anatomy. The applause around him was thunderous. "Take Mr. Henderson here," the curator said, nodding at the statue. "Bodybuilder, influencer, spent 6 hours a day in the gym, spent his life staring at himself in mirrors, obsessing over every vein, every striation. He wanted to be the perfect physical specimen. He wanted everyone to look at him. So, the CEO granted his wish. He is now a perfect physical specimen. He will never age, he will never lose muscle mass, and he will be looked at forever." "He's in agony," I whispered, looking at the man's terrified eyes. "He is in perfection," the curator corrected. "The agony comes from the fact that he is still in there. You see, the specific torture of the Hall of Fame is that you get the fame, but you lose the agency. You wanted to be an object of worship? Fine. You are an object. Objects do not move. Objects do not speak. Objects do not sleep." He turned his gray, static eyes toward me. "You spent 48 years treating yourself like a product, Elena. You polished the packaging. You marketed the brand. You sold the image. Why are you upset that we are finally putting the product on the shelf?" I couldn't answer. His logic was a trap I couldn't navigate. It was twisted, cruel, and terrifyingly accurate. I had treated myself like a product. I had dehumanized myself long before I got here. We continued the tour. The aisle opened up into a rotunda. In the center of the room was a massive circular screen suspended from the ceiling. It was playing a montage of video feeds. "We call this the legacy monitor," the curator said, clasping his hands behind his back. "Most of our guests are obsessed with their legacy. They want to know how the world is mourning them. They want to see the impact of their absence. We find that showing them the truth is highly effective for the hardening process." He tapped his tablet. The giant screen flickered and changed. I gasped. It was a live feed from Dubai. I saw my office. It was a mess. People were moving boxes. I saw my second-in-command, a woman named Sarah, whom I had mentored, whom I thought was loyal to me. She was standing at my desk, my custom-made Italian glass desk. She was on the phone. I could hear the audio clearly, piped into the hall. "Yes, she's gone," Sarah was saying. Her voice wasn't sad. It was brisk, businesslike. "It was a stroke. Look, it's tragic, obviously, but we need to pivot. The clients are nervous. Tell the Shakes team that under my leadership, things will be more streamlined." Elena was difficult, old school. We can finally modernize. I felt a sharp physical pain in my chest. She's taking my clients," I whispered. "She hasn't even buried me yet." The curator smiled. "She is doing exactly what you taught her to do, Elena. You taught her that emotion is weakness. You taught her that the brand survives the person. She is a good student." The screen changed. It showed my apartment. My housekeeper was there with her daughter. They were going through my closet. The daughter was holding up the blue silk dress I was wearing right now, or a duplicate of it. She was holding it against her body, laughing. "Look at this," the girl said. "It's so small. She starved herself to fit into this." "She was a deeply unhappy woman," the housekeeper replied, tossing a pair of my shoes into a donation bag. Always looking in the mirror, never smiling, I felt sorry for her. Sorry for me? The indignation flared hot in my throat. I was the Iron Orchid. I was feared. I was respected. How dare she pity me? "You see," the curator whispered, leaning close to my ear. "They don't worship you. They don't miss you. They are dividing your spoils. You are already fading, Elena. The world is closing over the water where you sank, and there isn't even a ripple." "Turn it off," I sobbed, closing my eyes. "I don't want to see it." "You must see it," he hissed. "This is the reality of the idol. The idol promises immortality, but it delivers oblivion. You sacrificed your marriage, your potential children, your friendships, and your soul for a legacy that lasted exactly 6 hours after your heart stopped. He tapped the tablet again. The screen went black. "But do not worry," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Here, you will matter. Here, you will have an audience that never leaves." He steered me away from the rotunda and back toward the aisle, where my empty pedestal waited. The walk felt shorter this time. The dread was making time compress. I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my body. My knees were stiffening. I was losing the ability to bend my joints. I was walking like a marionette. What happens when I get on the pedestal?" I asked, my voice trembling with the tremors of a terrified child. "The process is simple," the curator explained, as if describing a spa treatment. "We place you on the mount. The spotlight activates. It is a special light, pure, concentrated judgment. It reveals everything. It burns away the soft human parts of you, the empathy, the hope, the ability to change. It hardens the shell. You will be locked in your final pose. Your eyes will remain open. Your hearing will be amplified." He stopped. We were back at the black marble pedestal with my name bleeding in gold and red. "And then," he said, gesturing to the darkness below the edge of the stage, "the fans arrive." I looked down into the pit again. The shadows were surging. The applause was frantic, hungry. "Who are they?" I asked. "Are they demons?" "They are the spirits of envy," the curator said. "They are the spirits of mockery. In life, you fed them. You posted photos to make people jealous. You gave interviews to make people feel small. You fed the demons of envy in the hearts of others. Now, they have come to feed on you. They will stare at you. They will point out your flaws. They will laugh at your aging. They will mock your silence. And you will stand there perfectly still and take it, forever." He stepped closer to me. The gray static in his eyes seemed to be swirling faster. "You wanted to be the center of attention, Elena. The center is a target." He raised his hand. 2 of the faceless bouncers I had seen at the entrance emerged from the shadows. They grabbed my arms. Their grip was like steel vices. I screamed, but the sound was weak. My chest was hardening. My lungs were losing their elasticity. "Wait!" I cried. "I changed my mind. I don't want this. I want to go back. I'll be anonymous. I'll be a nobody." The curator looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "That is the tragedy, my dear," he said softly. "You had a lifetime to be a nobody. You had a lifetime to be humble. But you chose the spotlight. We simply kept the lights on for you." He nodded to the bouncers. "Mount the exhibit." They lifted me off the ground. My legs, now stiff and heavy as lead, dragged uselessly. I kicked and thrashed, but I was fighting against granite. They swung me up onto the black marble pedestal. My heels clicked against the stone, a sharp final sound. "Pose her," the curator commanded. One of the bouncers grabbed my jaw and wrenched my head up. The other grabbed my right arm and forced it into a wave, the royal wave I had practiced for years. "Perfect," the curator said, stepping back and holding up his hands to frame the shot. The Queen of Nothing, presiding over her kingdom of dust. He tapped the tablet one last time. "Activate the main spot." A sound like a jet engine starting up filled the air. Above me, the largest spotlight in the hall hummed to life. A beam of white, searing heat slammed down onto me. It didn't burn my skin like fire, it burned like ice. It penetrated through the silk dress, through the hardening skin, and struck the very center of my soul. I tried to close my eyes. I couldn't. My eyelids had turned to stone. I tried to lower my arm. It was fused in the air. I was trapped. I was a statue. But inside the marble shell, my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, screaming into a darkness that had no exit. The curator bowed to me. "Enjoy the show, Elena." He turned and walked away into the gloom, leaving me alone in the light. And then the whispering started. The transformation of a human being into an object is a violation of the soul so profound that language struggles to contain it. We are designed for movement, for breath, for the subtle, constant shifting of weight that proves we are alive. But as that blinding white spotlight pinned me to the black marble pedestal, I felt the biological privilege of movement being stripped away, layer by agonizing layer. It began in the extremities. The cold I had felt earlier was replaced by a terrifying heaviness, a density that defied physics. It felt as if my blood, the very fluid of my life, was turning into wet concrete, thickening and slowing within my veins. I could feel the pulse in my wrists throb once, twice, a sluggish, heavy beat against the hardening skin, and then stop. The silence of my own body was louder than the roaring applause around me. I tried to drop my arm. I screamed at my brain to send the signal, to fire the neurons, to simply lower my hand to my side. But my right arm remained frozen in that grotesque, regal wave, the signature gesture of the iron orchid. The muscles had ceased to be tissue. They were becoming structure. I could feel the fibers fusing together, calcifying into a rigid, unyielding material that was harder than bone. The panic that surged through me was primal. It was the panic of being buried alive, but worse because I wasn't in a coffin. I was the coffin. My chest ceased to rise and fall. The breath I had taken just before the bouncers hoisted me up was trapped in my lungs. I waited for the suffocation to kill me. I waited for the black spots to dance across my vision, for the mercy of unconsciousness. But in this place, biology does not dictate survival. You do not need air to exist here. You only need air to scream. And I could no longer scream. My jaw was locked, my throat petrified. I was a consciousness trapped inside a statue, fully awake, fully aware, but utterly disconnected from the world of action. Then, the drying began. The spotlight above me wasn't just light, it was a desiccant. I felt the moisture evaporating from my eyes. In life, we blink to lubricate our vision, a reflex we take for granted. Here, my eyelids were stone. They would not close. I was forced to stare into the middle distance, my eyes burning with a gritty, sandy dryness that grew more excruciating with every passing second. It felt as if someone were rubbing coarse salt into my corneas, but I couldn't rub them. I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't even cry to wash the dust away. I was forced to see. And what I saw was the arrival of the fans. The curator had promised them, and the curator did not lie. From the dark pit that surrounded the stage, they began to emerge. They didn't climb up like humans. They slithered and scuttled, defying gravity, moving like insects up the sheer face of the marble platform. At first, they looked like shadows, vague shapes of darkness. But as they crawled into the halo of my spotlight, the light revealed their true forms. They were hideous distortions of the people I had courted my entire life. They looked like paparazzi, but their cameras were fused to their faces, lenses replacing eyes, zooming in and out with a wet, mechanical whirring sound. They looked like gossip columnists, their mouths elongated into jagged snouts, filled with dripping ink. They looked like the social climbers I had despised, wearing tattered, rotting versions of couture gowns, their skin hanging loosely off their skeletal frames. They gathered around the base of my pedestal, a writhing, seething mass of envy and malice. There must have been hundreds of them. They were small, hunched, and grotesque, but their eyes, those that had eyes, were burning with a frantic, hungry intelligence. The applause from the invisible auditorium faded slightly, making room for the sounds of the creatures at my feet. They didn't roar. They chattered. It was a high-pitched, frenetic sound, like 1,000 rats gnawing on bone. One of them, a creature with a face like a smashed mirror and hands that ended in long, sharp quills, climbed up onto the edge of my pedestal. It brought its face inches from my frozen knee. I could smell its breath, It smelled of sour milk and old lies. "Is this her?" the creature hissed, its voice scratching against the air. "Is this the iron orchid?" Another creature, this one with a mouth that was sewn shut, but who spoke through a slit in its throat, scrambled up beside it. "It looks like her, but look at the texture, look at the pores." The creature with the quill fingers reached out. I mentally recoiled, bracing for pain, but I couldn't move. It ran a sharp, dirty claw up the side of my leg, scratching the surface of my alabaster skin. It didn't hurt like a cut. It hurt like a violation. It was a sensation of deep, resounding wrongness, like a nail on a chalkboard echoing through my entire nervous system. "She used to be so smooth," the creature sneered, turning to the crowd below. "But look here, cellulite. Even in stone she has cellulite." The crowd of demons erupted in a chorus of cackling laughter. It wasn't funny. It was hateful. They were weaponizing the very insecurities I had spent thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to hide. "She looks old!" another voice shrieked from the back. "Look at the neck. The statue doesn't lie. The neck always tells the truth." "She's fake," another chanted. "It's all filler. It's all structure. There's nothing inside." The mockery hit me like physical blows. In life, I could dismiss critics. I could fire employees who whispered. I could retreat to my penthouse, pour a glass of expensive wine, and tell myself they were just jealous. I could block them on social media. I could curate my reality. But here, there was no block button. There was no penthouse. There was only the pedestal. I was forced to stand there, naked in my soul, while these monsters dissected every flaw I had ever agonized over. They knew exactly where to aim. They didn't mock my business acumen or my intelligence. They mocked my beauty, my relevance, the things I had turned into idols. "She thinks she's a queen," the mirror-faced demon whispered, tapping its claw against my frozen shin. "But look at her eyes. She's terrified. The iron orchid is wilting." He leaned in closer, his lens eyes zooming in until I could hear the motor whirring against my skin. "Do you know why we are here, Elena?" he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "We are the echoes of every time you made someone feel small so you could feel big. We are the spirits of comparison. You fed us. You fed us with every Instagram post, every press release, every judgmental glance you threw at a younger woman. You built this audience. We are your greatest creation." The horror of his words sank deeper than the paralysis. He was right. I had spent my life creating an image designed to make others envy me. I wanted them to look at me and feel less than. I had weaponized my success, and now the envy I had cultivated had taken form, and it was eating me alive. The heat from the spotlight seemed to intensify. I felt a phantom sensation of sweat trying to break through the stone skin, but it couldn't. The heat was baking the shame into me. I wanted to look away from the demons. I wanted to look down, to close my eyes, to look anywhere but at the grotesque faces reveling in my humiliation. But my head was fixed. My gaze was locked on the middle distance, forcing me to see not just the demons at my feet, but the other statues in the aisle. I saw the man on the chrome pedestal across from me. The demons were swarming him too. They were tearing at his metallic suit, laughing at his power pose, mocking his net worth. I saw the tears of oil leaking from his unblinking eyes. I saw the pop star on the rose-gold pedestal, surrounded by creatures mimicking her songs in screeching, off-key voices, turning her art into a torture track. We were all alone together. That was the specific cruelty of this place. We were surrounded by millions of beings, yet we were in absolute isolation. I couldn't call out to the man in chrome. He couldn't comfort me. We were islands of regret, separated by seas of mockery. Time began to distort. In the mortal world, time is measured by heartbeats, by breaths, by the movement of the sun. Here, there were no heartbeats. The light never changed. The applause never stopped. There was no way to measure the passing of existence. Was I there for an hour? A day? A year? The concept of forever began to settle on me like a suffocating blanket. I realized that this wasn't a temporary holding cell. This was the final destination. The curator had called it a permanent exhibit. Permanent. The word echoed in the hollow chamber of my mind. I would never sit down again. I would never sleep again. I would never feel the cool side of a pillow, or the taste of water, or the silence of a dark room. I would stand here, hand raised in a stupid, arrogant wave, while monsters laughed at my wrinkles and analyzed my failures until the end of time. Panic, fresh and hot, surged through my paralyzed consciousness. I tried to struggle. I pushed with every ounce of will I had against the stone shell. I screamed internally, a primal, wordless cry of rejection. I don't want to be this. I don't want to be the iron orchid. Take it back. I'll be ugly. I'll be poor. Just let me move. Just let me close my eyes. But the stone did not yield. The demons only laughed harder, sensing my internal struggle. "She's fighting it!" one of them squealed, hopping up and down on the base of the pedestal. "Look at the tension in the jaw. She wants to get down. She thinks she can leave." "She thinks she has power here," another jeered. "She thinks she's the boss." The mirror-faced demon climbed higher, digging his claws into the folds of my petrified dress, pulling himself up until he was face to face with me. He blocked the light, casting a jagged shadow over my frozen eyes. "You are not the boss, Elena," he whispered, his breath hot and rancid on my face. "You are the furniture." He tapped my cheek with a hard, sharp finger. Click, click, click. The sound of his claw on my face was the sound of my dignity shattering. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a thing to be looked at, critiqued, and used. And in that moment of absolute objectification, staring into the lens eye of a demon who knew my darkest secrets, something inside me broke. Not the stone shell, that held firm, but the construct of my ego, the iron orchid persona I had spent 48 years building, finally snapped under the weight of the truth. I wasn't a queen. I wasn't a mogul. I wasn't powerful. I was a scared, lonely woman who had painted herself into a corner with gold paint, and now the paint had dried, and I was stuck. The realization was more painful than the heat, more cutting than the mockery. I saw myself clearly for the first time in decades, and I hated what I saw. The demon saw it too. He pulled back, his lens whirling. "Oh," he said, sounding disappointed. "She's breaking. The pride is leaking out." "Good," the voice of the curator boomed from somewhere in the darkness above. "Let her break. The shell is strongest when the soul is crushed." But the curator was wrong. He didn't understand the physics of what was happening inside me. He thought breaking meant submission. He didn't know that when a soul truly breaks, when it shatters completely, it leaves a crack that lets the light in. But for now, there was no light, only the blinding spot, the cheering monsters, and the terrifying eternal silence of my own frozen heart. I had spent my entire life building a fortress, stone by stone, press release by press release, lie by lie. I thought the fortress was protecting me. I thought the walls of the iron orchid kept me safe from pain, from rejection, from the messy, uncontrollable chaos of being human. But as I stood there, encased in the marble tomb of my own making, I realized the terrifying truth. The fortress was not a castle, it was a dungeon, and I had locked myself inside and swallowed the key. The demons at my feet continued their chattering, their lenses whirring, their claws tapping against my petrified skin. They were waiting for a reaction. They were waiting for me to rage, to cry, to assert my dominance. That was the food they craved. They wanted the friction of my ego rubbing against the reality of my damnation. As long as I tried to be someone, I was feeding them. As long as I held on to the name Elena Vance, I was their prisoner. But the breaking I felt inside was not a fracture of weakness. It was the collapse of a load-bearing wall that should never have been built in the first place. I stopped fighting the paralysis. I stopped trying to lower my arm. I stopped trying to look away from the monsters. Instead, I looked inward. I descended into the dark, cold basement of my own soul, past the ambition, past the awards, past the carefully curated memories. I went down to the place I had avoided for 48 years, the place of my emptiness. I saw myself not as the world saw me, but as I truly was. I was a frightened little girl who thought that if she was beautiful enough, her father wouldn't have left. I was a lonely woman who thought that if she was powerful enough, she wouldn't need love. I saw the rot beneath the gilding. I saw the selfishness that I had rebranded as drive. I saw the cruelty I had rebranded as honesty. I was ugly. The realization washed over me, not with shame, but with a strange, devastating clarity. I was spiritually hideous. The demons mocking my physical flaws were missing the point. My skin was fine. It was my heart that was covered in scars and warts. I was a beggar dressed in silk, demanding to be treated like a queen. I am nothing, I thought. The words formed in my mind, quiet and small, barely audible over the roar of the applause. The demon with the mirror face stopped tapping my leg. He tilted his head, his lens contracting. He sensed the shift. The energy coming off me was changing. It wasn't the hot, spicy scent of pride anymore. It was something else, something he didn't recognize. "What is she doing?" he hissed to the others. "The flavor. It's spoiling." I ignored him. I focused on that tiny seed of truth in the center of my being. "I am nothing," I repeated, louder this time in the echo chamber of my skull. "I don't want to be remembered. I don't want a legacy. I don't want to be the Iron Orchid. Burn it. Burn it all down." I looked at the Iron Orchid identity, the statue I had become, and I rejected it. I hated it. It was a false god, and it had failed me. I didn't want to be worshipped. I wanted to be saved, but I knew, with a despair that felt bottomless, that I couldn't save myself. I was stone. I was fixed. I needed a hammer. And I knew the name of the hammer. I had mocked it. I had laughed at my assistant when she spoke it. I had deleted emails that contained it. I had treated it like a curse word, a crutch for the weak. But here, in the absolute center of my weakness, I realized it was the only word that possessed any weight. The name Elena Vance was dust. The name Iron Orchid was a joke. There was only one name that had authority over the dead. I didn't pray a polite prayer. I didn't have time for theology or ritual. I screamed. I screamed from the deepest, softest, most vulnerable part of me that the stone hadn't reached yet. Jesus! The name didn't leave my lips. My lips were marble. But it blasted out of my spirit like a shockwave. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment my soul formed that name, the applause stopped. It didn't fade out. It was severed. The roar of the millions of invisible hands was cut off, as if a blade had sliced through the audio cables of the universe. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the hall. It was a pregnant, vibrating silence. The air in the vast chamber suddenly pressurized. The temperature spiked. The freezing cold that had preserved us began to thaw, replaced by a heat that felt alive, urgent, and terrifyingly pure. The demons at my feet shrieked. It wasn't the mocking laughter of before. It was a scream of genuine pain. They scrambled back from my pedestal, covering their lens eyes, their claws skittering on the black floor. "Stop it!" the mirror-faced demon howled, his voice distorting into static. "Stop the signal. She's transmitting. Cut her off." But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The dam had broken. "I am sorry," I screamed internally, the tears I couldn't weep physically pouring through my spirit. "I am so sorry. I made myself a god. I stole your glory. I am a thief. I am a liar. I don't want to be me anymore. Take this away. Break me. Shatter me." The spotlight above me, the one that had been baking the vanity into my skin, flickered. It turned from a harsh, clinical white to a sickly yellow, and then it exploded. Pop! The bulb shattered, raining hot glass down onto my marble shoulders. But the darkness didn't return. Instead, a new light began to bleed into the hall. It didn't come from the ceiling. It didn't come from a fixture. It seemed to tear through the fabric of the dimension itself. It was a light that had no source, a blinding, radiant gold that was brighter than 1,000 suns, but carried no heat, only weight. The curator appeared out of the shadows. He was running. The composure, the slick suit, the tablet, it was all gone. His face was contorted in a mask of fury and fear. His skin was peeling back, revealing the raw, smoking darkness beneath. "Silence her!" he roared at the bouncers. "She is breaching the containment! She is bringing him here!" The bouncers lunged toward me, their faceless heads splitting open to reveal maws of jagged teeth. They reached for my pedestal, trying to grab me, to crush the prayer out of me. But they couldn't touch me. The air around my pedestal had become solid. A barrier of pure authority had formed around the repentant heart. When their hands hit the invisible wall, they hissed and recoiled, their skin blistering as if they had touched a hot stove. I felt a vibration start deep in my chest. It wasn't the tremor of fear. It was the frequency of the name I was calling. It was the resonance of truth. Crack. The sound was loud, sharp, and sickening. I looked down. A fissure had appeared on my marble arm. It started at my wrist and zigzagged up to my elbow. Crack. Snap. Another fracture appeared on my chest. Then another on my legs. The stone shell, the perfect, immutable image of the iron orchid, was failing. It couldn't contain the expanding force of my repentance. The vanity was rigid, but the spirit was fluid, and the fluid was boiling. "I don't want to be a statue," I cried out to the light that was flooding the room. "I want to be your child. Make me small. Make me nothing. Just save me." The curator fell to his knees, covering his ears, screaming as the sound of my prayer tore through the artificial reality of his museum. The other statues in the aisle, the chrome man, the glass woman, began to vibrate. The resonance was spreading. My refusal to be an idol was shaking the foundations of the idol factory. "You cannot leave!" the curator shrieked, his voice sounding tinny and weak against the rising power. "You signed the contract. You lived for yourself. You belong to the exhibition." "I resign," I screamed back. "I resign from myself." That was the key. The moment I fully, truly resigned the position of being the god of my own life, the contract dissolved. The light intensified to a level that should have blinded me. It washed over the pedestal, swallowing the demons, swallowing the curator, swallowing the endless rows of frozen souls. It was a tidal wave of grace, violent and overwhelming. I felt a pressure building inside the stone shell that was unbearable. It felt like my heart was expanding to the size of a star. The marble skin couldn't hold it. The iron orchid couldn't hold it. With a sound like a thunderclap, the statue exploded. I felt the heavy, cold material of my vanity blast outward. Shards of marble, of gold, of lead, the debris of my ego, were blown away into the nothingness. The weight vanished. The paralysis vanished. The cold vanished. I was falling again. But this time I wasn't falling into darkness. I was falling upwards. I was being pulled by a force that was gentle, warm, and infinitely strong. I was leaving the pit. I was leaving the applause. I was leaving the Hall of Fame. I felt a sensation I hadn't felt since I was a child. I felt safe. I felt held. I was no longer a brand. I was no longer a face. I was just a soul, naked and trembling, wrapped in a light that knew everything I had ever done and loved me anyway. The roaring of the hall faded into a distant, angry murmur and then into silence. But this silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm that has finally passed. I closed my eyes, my real eyes, wet with real tears, and for the first time in an eternity, I rested. The first sensation was not sight nor sound, but weight. I felt the crushing, undeniable gravity of the earth pressing me down into a mattress. After the terrifying, weightless suspension of the void and the rigid paralysis of the statue, the feeling of gravity was a gift. It meant I had a body. It meant I was biological again. It meant I was soft. Then came the pain. It washed over me in a rhythmic, throbbing tide. A sharp ache in my chest, a pounding pressure in my skull, and a raw, burning sensation in my throat. I tried to inhale, but something was blocking my airway. I gagged, a violent, retching reflex that shook my entire frame. "She's back! Get the tube! Pull it now!" The voice was shouting, urgent and masculine, but it wasn't the smooth, predatory baritone of the curator. It was frantic, human, and laced with exhaustion. I felt hands on me, warm, rough hands. I felt a sliding sensation in my throat, a tearing pain, and then the obstruction was gone. I sucked in a breath of air. It tasted of antiseptic, latex, and recirculated oxygen. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. I coughed, my lungs spasming as they remembered how to work, expelling the stale air of death and filling with the sweet, burning air of life. "Easy, Elena, easy. Breathe with me." I opened my eyes. The light was bright, but it wasn't the searing, interrogating spotlight of the hall. It was the diffuse, gentle fluorescence of a hospital ICU. I blinked. My eyelids moved. I could feel the muscles contract and release. I blinked again, tears streaming down my temples, just to revel in the miracle of the movement. I am not stone. I am not stone. A face hovered over me. A doctor, his eyes rimmed with red, a surgical mask pulled down under his chin. He looked terrified. "Ms. Vance?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand." I looked at his hand resting on the bed rail. I sent the command to my fingers. They were weak, trembling like leaves in a storm, but they obeyed. I squeezed his fingers. The doctor let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He slumped back against a cart, running a hand through his hair. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You were flatline. You were gone. We called it. We actually called it." I tried to speak, but my voice was a rusted hinge. "How long?" I croaked. 7 minutes, he said, looking at the monitor that was beeping a steady, reassuring rhythm. "You had a massive cerebral hemorrhage followed by cardiac arrest. Clinically, you were dead for 7 minutes. We had stopped compressions, and then your heart just restarted. It didn't flutter. It slammed back into rhythm. I've never seen a kickstart like that without a defibrillator." I closed my eyes. 7 minutes. In the Hall of Fame, it had felt like 7 centuries. I had lived an entire eternity of torment in the time it took to boil an egg. Recovery was not the glamorous comeback story I would have once pitched to the press. It was slow, humiliating, and messy. The stroke had left me with a temporary weakness on my left side, and the Iron Orchid, the woman who ran empires, had to learn how to hold a spoon again. I had to be bathed by nurses. I had to be helped to the bathroom. In my old life, this would have been my worst nightmare. To be seen as weak, to be dependent, to be ugly in the harsh light of reality. It would have destroyed me. But something had changed. A week into my recovery, a nurse came in to change my bedding. She was a young Filipino woman, quiet and efficient. She hesitated by the bedside table. "Ms. Vance," she said softly, "would you like a mirror? Your assistant brought your makeup bag. She said you wouldn't want to see anyone without your face on." I looked at the bag sitting on the chair. It was the same brand of expensive concealer I had dropped on the bathroom floor. The tool of my trade. The paint I used to build the mask. "No," I said. My voice was stronger now, but it was lower, stripped of the sharp, commanding edge it used to have. "Hand me the mirror, but leave the bag." She looked surprised, but she handed me a small hand mirror. I lifted it. My hand was shaking, but I forced myself to look. The woman in the glass was a stranger. My skin was pale and waxy. There were dark bruises under my eyes from exhaustion. My hair, usually a perfectly coiffed helmet of expensive coloring, was gray at the roots, a secret I had kept hidden for years, and matted from the pillows. The left side of my mouth drooped slightly, a lingering souvenir of the stroke. I looked at the wrinkles around my eyes, the very wrinkles I had died trying to hide. I waited for the shame. I waited for the familiar voice of the curator to whisper in my ear, telling me I was hideous, that I was finished, that I was garbage. But the voice didn't come. Instead, I felt a wave of overwhelming affection for the face in the mirror. It was a broken face. It was an aging face. It was a mortal face. But it was my face. It wasn't a statue. It could move. It could cry. It could smile. I smiled at myself. The droop made the smile crooked, asymmetrical. "It's perfect," I whispered. The nurse looked at me, confused. "Ma'am?" "It's perfect because it's real," I said, handing the mirror back. "Take the makeup bag away. Donate it. Throw it out. I don't care. I won't be needing it." The dismantling of the Iron Orchid began the day I left the hospital. I didn't go back to the penthouse. I couldn't bear the thought of that cold, gold-plated mausoleum. I instructed my lawyers to sell it. I sold the furniture, the art, the silk dresses, the mirrors, especially the mirrors. Then I went to the office. I walked in unannounced. I wasn't wearing a power suit. I was wearing loose linen trousers and a simple white shirt. No makeup, my gray roots visible. I walked with a cane. The silence that fell over the PR firm was absolute. People stared. Some looked horrified. Some looked embarrassed to be seen looking at me. I walked past the reception desk, past the glass walls of the conference rooms where I had destroyed careers and built lies. I went straight to my assistant's desk. The girl I had mocked. The girl who had tried to show me the testimony. She looked up, her eyes widening. She stood up, knocking her chair over. "Ms. Vance? Oh my God. We heard you were... Are you okay?" I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the kindness in her face, the concern that I didn't deserve. "I'm not Ms. Vance," I said softly. "I'm just Elena, and I owe you an apology." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You tried to warn me," I said, tears filling my eyes. "You tried to show me the truth, and I laughed at you. I want you to know, I saw it. I saw where the arrogant go. And you were right. It is real. And he is real." She started to cry. She walked around the desk, and ignoring every protocol of our former relationship, she hugged me. I held on to her, weeping in the middle of the office floor, while my employees watched in stunned silence. I didn't care about their gaze. I didn't care about the whispers. Let them whisper. It was better than the applause of the dead. I closed the firm. It wasn't a popular decision. There were lawsuits, angry clients, confused partners. Sarah, my second in command, was furious. She told me I was having a nervous breakdown, that the stroke had made me senile. She told me I was throwing away a legacy worth millions. "I'm not throwing away a legacy, Sarah," I told her as I signed the dissolution papers. "I'm escaping a prison. You can have the clients, you can have the fame, but I'm telling you now, as someone who has seen the end of that road, the pedestal is a trap. Get off it before you turn to stone." She didn't listen. She started her own agency the next day. I pray for her every night. My life now is unrecognizable to the woman I was. I live in a small house on the outskirts of the city, far from the skyscrapers and the neon lights. I don't attend galas. I don't give interviews. My name has faded from the papers, just as the curator predicted. To the world, Elena Vance is a tragic figure, a powerful woman who lost her mind and disappeared. But I have never been more sane. I spend my days volunteering at a hospice center for the terminally ill. I sit with people who are crossing the threshold. I hold their hands. I listen to their regrets. I tell them about the light I saw. I tell them that it's not too late, that the name of Jesus can shatter even the hardest stone. There are no mirrors in my house. I don't need them. I don't need to check if I exist. I know I exist because He loves me. Sometimes at night, when the wind howls outside, I get a flashback. I hear the phantom sound of that roaring applause. I feel the cold creeping into my joints. I remember the feeling of being a statue, trapped, staring at the demons of envy. The terror tries to rise up, to paralyze me again. But then I whisper the name, Jesus. And the memory shatters. The warmth returns. The silence of the room becomes a sanctuary, not a void. I am writing this testimony because I know there are women and men listening to me right now who are building their own pedestals. You are curating your lives. You are obsessed with how you are perceived. You are terrified of aging, terrified of irrelevance, terrified of being no one. I am here to tell you that the Hall of Fame is real. There is a place reserved for those who want to be worshipped. And it is a place of absolute freezing loneliness. Do not wait until you are a statue to scream for help. Do not wait until the cement dries around your heart. Break the mirror, step out of the light, walk off the stage. If you have stayed with me until the end of this story, I want to ask you to do one small thing, not for me, but for yourself. Subscribe to this channel, not because we want numbers, but because stories like this are lighthouses. We are trying to warn the ships before they hit the rocks. Join us. Let this be the moment you turn the ship around. I am Elena. I used to be the iron orchid. Now I am just dust. But I am dust that breathes, dust that loves, and dust that has been washed clean. And I would rather be a living nobody in the arms of God than a golden statue in the halls of hell. God bless you.